Hey everyone! Tonight we step into the skies above wartime Germany through the eyes of a young British bomber pilot on the night of Operation Millennium. It was the RAF's first 1,000 bomber raid, an audacious display of force aimed squarely at the heart of Cologne. But behind the grand numbers and statistics was the weight of fear, the silence of crews bracing for flak, and the hum of engines carrying men toward danger. Before we lift off, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy this kind of immersive storytelling. It helps us keep making these peaceful, reflective journeys through history. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Drop your location and the time in the comments. It's always amazing to see this sleepy little community stretching across the world. Now settle in. Let the low drone of engines lull you, and prepare for a quiet journey into the clouds and into memory. The late spring evening of May 29th, 1942, settled quietly over RAF Wickenby in Lincolnshire. The air was still and warm, carrying the familiar scents of aviation fuel and freshly cut grass across the dispersal points where the Avro Manchester bombers of the 12th Squadron sat waiting in the gathering dusk. Flight Lieutenant James Morrison ran his hand along the cold metal of his aircraft's fuselage, feeling the slight vibration that seemed to emanate from within even when the engines were silent. Morrison had been flying operations over occupied Europe for 8 months now. At 23, he was considered an old hand among the crews, though the lines around his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands when he thought no one was looking betrayed the strain of those months. Tonight felt different somehow. There had been unusual activity around the base all day, more senior officers than usual, hushed conversations that stopped when aircrew approached, and a tension in the air that even the most junior flight sergeant could sense. The briefing room at Wickenby was packed tighter than Morrison had ever seen it. Every seat was taken, with late arrivals standing along the walls and crowding near the doorway. Squadron Leader Davies stood at the front, his usually composed demeanour showing signs of barely contained excitement. Behind him, a large map of Western Europe was covered by a cloth sheet, concealing their target for the evening. "Gentlemen," Davies began, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent room, "tonight we are taking part in something unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare." The cloth was pulled away with theatrical precision, revealing a map marked with a thick red line stretching from various points across England, all converging on a single German city. Operation Millennium, 1,000 bombers, Cologne. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds before breaking into a mixture of gasps, whistles, and nervous laughter. Morrison felt his stomach tighten. He had flown to Cologne twice before. It was always a difficult target, heavily defended and deep enough into enemy territory to test fuel reserves on the return journey. Davies continued his briefing with methodical precision. "This operation has been personally authorised by the Prime Minister. We will be joined by aircraft from Training Command, Coastal Command, and every operational squadron Bomber Command can muster. The first wave will cross the enemy coast at 23:30 hours. The entire raid is to be completed within 90 minutes to maximise concentration and minimise our exposure to enemy defences." Pilot Officer William Chen, sitting 2 rows ahead of Morrison, raised his hand. At barely 21, Chen was one of the youngest pilots on the squadron, but his navigation skills were already legendary among the crews. "Sir, what about moon conditions? Won't we be sitting ducks in this light?" "The moon will be full, Chen, which presents both advantages and disadvantages. You'll be able to see your targets more clearly, but Jerry will see you just as well. The weather section reports clear skies over the target area with light winds from the southwest." Davies paused, scanning the faces of his aircrew. "I won't lie to you, gentlemen. This will be dangerous, but it will also be historic." Morrison's wireless operator, Sergeant Tommy Harrison, leaned over and whispered, "1,000 bombers, Jimmy. Can you imagine what that's going to look like over the target?" Harrison was a Londoner who had volunteered for aircrew duty after his family's house was destroyed in the Blitz. He had a personal score to settle with the Luftwaffe, and it showed in his meticulous attention to every detail of their operations. The briefing continued for another hour, covering routes, timing, altitudes, and recognition signals. Morrison made careful notes in his logbook, sketching the route and marking key waypoints. The primary target was the city centre of Cologne, with particular emphasis on railway yards and industrial areas. Secondary targets included marshalling yards and any identifiable military installations. As the crews filed out of the briefing room, the conversation was unusually subdued. Morrison walked slowly back to his quarters with his crew, the magnitude of the operation beginning to sink in. Flight Sergeant Bob Matthews, his rear gunner, finally broke the silence. "My dad was at the Somme," he said quietly. "He used to tell me about the artillery barrages before they went over the top. Hundreds of guns firing together for hours on end. I wonder if this is what that felt like for the Germans on the receiving end." Morrison nodded but said nothing. Matthews was from Yorkshire, a farmer's son who had joined the RAF in 1940 with dreams of becoming a fighter pilot. Poor eyesight had relegated him to the rear gunner position in a bomber crew, but his steady nerves and excellent shooting had already saved their aircraft twice during attacks by German night fighters. The crew dispersed to their individual preparations. Morrison made his way to the mess hall, though his appetite had largely disappeared. The hall buzzed with conversation about the operation, but voices were kept low as if speaking too loudly might somehow alert the enemy to what was planned. At a corner table, he recognized several pilots from other squadrons, men he had trained with or encountered at various stations over the past months. Squadron leader Peter Turnbull from 44 Squadron was among them, a veteran of some of Bomber Command's earliest operations. Morrison had heard Turnbull speak before about the evolution of their tactics and strategy. "When I started flying ops in early 1940, Turnbull was saying to the small group around him, "we were lucky to get 50 aircraft to a target. Now we're talking about 1,000. It shows how far we've come, but also how much we've had to learn." Flight Lieutenant David Parker, a pilot from the 50th Squadron, nodded in agreement. Parker had been shot down over France the previous autumn and spent 6 weeks evading capture before making it back to England through Spain. "The thing is," Parker continued, "the Germans have been learning too. Their night fighter techniques have improved enormously since 1940. They've got better radar, better coordination between their fighters and flak batteries. 1,000 bombers sounds impressive, but it also means 1,000 chances for them to get lucky." Morrison joined their conversation, ordering a cup of tea from the NAAFI orderly. "What concerns me," he said, settling into a chair, "is coordination. We've never attempted anything on this scale before. The potential for mid-air collisions alone." "That's been thought of," Turnbull replied. "Different squadrons will be flying at different altitudes, and the timing has been calculated to minimise overlap over the target area. But you're right, it's going to be like nothing we've ever attempted before." The conversation drifted to technical matters: fuel loads, bomb configurations, expected weather conditions. Morrison learned that his squadron would be carrying a mixed load of high explosive and incendiary bombs designed to start fires that would guide later waves to their targets. The thought of the destruction they were about to unleash on a German city troubled him, but he pushed such considerations aside. This was war, and Cologne was a legitimate military target with significant industrial capacity supporting the German war effort. As the evening progressed, Morrison found himself thinking about home. His parents lived in a small village in Somerset, where his father worked as a solicitor and his mother tended to an extensive garden that had become even more important since rationing began. They had no real understanding of what he did on these night operations, and he preferred it that way. His letters home were carefully censored, both by official requirements and his own desire to spare them unnecessary worry. The last letter from his mother received just 3 days earlier, had been full of news about the village, the progress of her vegetable garden, and her work with the local Women's Voluntary Service. She had mentioned, almost in passing, that young Robert Fletcher from the village had been reported missing over Germany. Morrison remembered Robert, 2 years younger, enthusiastic about flying, full of confidence about the war being over by Christmas 1941. Now he was gone, somewhere over occupied Europe, and Morrison found himself wondering how many more names would be added to the village war memorial before this conflict ended. The sound of aircraft engines being tested interrupted his reverie. Through the mess hall windows, he could see ground crews working on the dispersed bombers, checking and double-checking every system. The Avro Manchester was still relatively new to operational service, though it had already gained a reputation for engine troubles. Morrison's aircraft, designated R5830, had been more reliable than most, but he never took off without a small knot of worry about whether both Rolls-Royce Vulture engines would continue running throughout the mission. His navigator, Flying Officer Michael Stevens, appeared at his elbow. Stevens was a quiet man from Wales who had been a mathematics teacher before the war. His precision, with calculations and ability to find their way home in almost any weather conditions, had made him invaluable to the crew. "Jimmy, I've been working on our route timings," Stevens said, spreading a chart on the table. "With the fuel load we're carrying tonight, we'll have very little margin for error. If we encounter strong headwinds over the target area or have to make any significant diversions, it could get quite tight on the return journey." Morrison studied the chart, noting the carefully plotted course that would take them across the North Sea, over the Dutch coast, near IJmuiden, then southeast, across occupied Netherlands, and into Germany. The route back was planned to take them slightly further south, crossing the German border near Aachen and returning via a different section of the Dutch coast to minimise the risk of running into German defences that might have been alerted by the outbound stream of bombers. "What's our estimated time to target?" Morrison asked. "Approximately 3 hours and 20 minutes from takeoff," Stevens replied. "We're scheduled to be over Cologne at 0047 hours, which puts us in the second wave. The idea is that the first wave will have started fires to mark the target area for us." Morrison nodded, though privately he wondered about the wisdom of relying on fires started by other crews. Weather could change rapidly, and smoke from early bombing might actually obscure targets rather than illuminate them. But such concerns were beyond his control. His job was to fly his aircraft and crew to the target, deliver their bombs as accurately as possible, and bring everyone home safely. The pre-flight meal was served at 2100 hours, bacon, eggs and fried bread, traditional fare for aircrew before operations. Morrison ate mechanically, his mind already focused on the flight ahead. Around him, other crews were going through the same ritual, the conversation gradually becoming more subdued as takeoff time approached. Flight Sergeant Harrison appeared with Morrison's flying gear, leather jacket, life vest, parachute harness, and the various pieces of equipment that would keep him alive if things went wrong over enemy territory. The routine of getting dressed for operations had become automatic over the months, but tonight Morrison found himself paying more attention to each item, checking and double-checking that everything was properly secured. The walk to the dispersal area was conducted in relative silence. R5830 sat waiting, its twin engines already warmed up by the ground crew. Chief Technician Williams, the crew chief responsible for Morrison's aircraft, met them at the hard stand. Williams was a veteran of the Royal Flying Corps from the previous war, and his experience with aircraft maintenance was invaluable to the squadron. "She's ready for you, sir," Williams reported, handing Morrison the Form 700 that documented the aircraft's airworthiness. "Both engines are running smoothly, fuel tanks are topped off, and we've double-checked the bomb load. You're carrying 4,000-pound high-explosive bombs and 18 incendiaries in the bomb bay, plus a full load of ammunition for the defensive guns." Morrison reviewed the paperwork quickly, then walked around the aircraft with Williams, conducting the external inspection that might reveal any problems that could prove fatal over enemy territory. The Manchester looked solid and dependable in the gathering darkness, though Morrison knew that appearances could be deceiving. Too many crews had been lost to mechanical failures that couldn't be detected during pre-flight inspections. The rest of his crew was already aboard, conducting their own checks of the various systems they would depend on during the next 6 hours. Morrison climbed through the entrance hatch and made his way forward to the pilot's position, settling into the familiar seat and beginning his own systematic check of the controls and instruments. The radio crackled to life with air traffic control, giving taxi instructions to the various aircraft preparing for departure. Morrison listened carefully, noting that the first aircraft were already beginning to move toward the runway. The sight of so many bombers preparing for takeoff simultaneously was unlike anything he had witnessed before. "All stations, this is Control," came the voice through his headphones. "Operation Millennium is go. Repeat, Operation Millennium is go. First aircraft cleared for takeoff at 22:15 hours. Morrison glanced at his watch. 2208 hours. In 7 minutes, the largest bombing operation in history would begin. He ran through his mental checklist one final time, then keyed his microphone to address his crew. "Right, lads, this is it. Everyone ready back there?" The responses came back quickly. Harrison confirming his radio equipment was functioning. Stevens reporting his navigation instruments were all working properly. Matthews in the rear turret announcing that his guns were loaded and ready, and the other crew members checking in from their positions throughout the aircraft. Morrison watched the first bomber begin its takeoff roll, engines roaring as it accelerated down the runway and lifted into the night sky. One by one, other aircraft followed, their navigation lights disappearing into the darkness as they climbed away from the airfield and began forming up for the long flight to Germany. "Control to Wickenby leader," came the call Morrison had been waiting for. "You are cleared for takeoff. Wind is light and variable, visibility unlimited. Good hunting." Morrison advanced the throttles, feeling the Manchester begin to move forward as it gathered speed. The runway lights flashed past with increasing frequency as the aircraft accelerated, and then they were airborne, climbing into the star-filled sky over Lincolnshire. As they gained altitude and began their turn toward the east, Morrison could see other aircraft around them, navigation lights winking in the darkness, the exhaust flames from dozens of engines creating a constellation of moving stars. Behind them, more bombers were still taking off from airfields across eastern England, all converging on the same target. Flying Officer Stevens provided a steady stream of navigation updates as they crossed the English coast and headed out over the North Sea. The weather was exactly as forecast, clear skies with excellent visibility and light winds. Morrison could see the phosphorescent wake of ships far below them, and occasionally the flash of a lighthouse marking some hazard to navigation. The formation gradually became more spread out as individual aircraft settled into their assigned altitudes and speeds. Morrison was flying at 14,000 feet, high enough to clear most of the German flak batteries, but low enough to ensure accuracy when they reached the target area. Around them, other Manchesters from the 12th Squadron maintained their positions in the loose formation that would carry them across occupied Europe. The first indication that they were approaching enemy territory came from the rear gunner. "Skipper, I can see searchlights ahead," Matthews reported over the intercom. "Looks like the Dutch coast defences are active tonight." Morrison could see them too, long fingers of white light sweeping across the sky, searching for the approaching bombers. Occasionally, one would lock onto an aircraft, creating a brilliant cone of light that would be joined by others until the hapless bomber was caught in a web of illumination that made it an easy target for anti-aircraft guns. "Navigator to pilot," Stevens called. "We're approaching the enemy coast. Alter course to 095 degrees to take us between the main defensive positions." Morrison made the course correction, watching as they passed over the Dutch coastline. Below them, he could see the flashes of anti-aircraft fire, though at their altitude the sound of the explosions was lost in the steady roar of their engines. The occasional burst of flak appeared around them, black puffs of smoke that marked where German gunners were trying to estimate their altitude and course. The flight across occupied Netherlands passed without incident, though Morrison was constantly aware of the defensive activity below them. German night fighters were known to be active in this area, and he kept a careful watch for the telltale exhausts that might indicate an attacking Messerschmitt or Junkers. "Pilot to all crew," Morrison announced as they crossed into German airspace. "We're now over enemy territory. Keep your eyes open and report anything unusual immediately." The landscape below them gradually changed from the flat polders of Holland to the more varied terrain of Western Germany. Morrison could see rivers reflecting the moonlight, and occasionally the glow of a blacked-out city trying to conceal its presence from the stream of bombers passing overhead. Flight Lieutenant Parker's words from earlier in the evening kept echoing in Morrison's mind. The Germans had indeed learned much about defending against night bombing attacks. Their radar systems were more sophisticated, their night fighters better coordinated, and their anti-aircraft defences more concentrated around important targets. The Cologne area was known to be particularly well defended, with multiple radar stations, several night fighter bases, and some of the heaviest flak concentrations in Western Germany. "Navigator to pilot," Stevens called again. 30 minutes to target. We should begin our descent to bombing altitude shortly." Morrison acknowledged and began a gradual descent toward their bombing altitude of 12,000 feet. Around them, other aircraft were doing the same, the loose formation beginning to compress as they approached their target. The sky ahead was beginning to show an orange glow that could only mean one thing. The first wave of bombers had found their target and begun their attack. As they drew closer to Cologne, the glow became more pronounced, and Morrison could begin to make out individual fires burning in the city below. The sight was both magnificent and terrible, a major industrial city beginning to burn under the concentrated attack of hundreds of bombers. "My God," whispered Harrison over the intercom. "Look at that." Morrison was looking, trying to balance his fascination with the spectacle below, against his need to concentrate on flying the aircraft safely through what was becoming an increasingly dangerous piece of airspace. Anti-aircraft fire was now visible from multiple positions around the city, creating a deadly fireworks display that posed a constant threat to every bomber in the stream. The radio frequency assigned to the operation crackled with brief transmissions, aircraft calling out fighter sightings, bombing results, and occasionally the last desperate message from a crew whose aircraft had been fatally damaged by enemy action. Morrison tried not to listen too closely to these communications, focusing instead on the job at hand. "Bomb aimer to pilot," came the voice of Sergeant Price from his position in the nose of the Manchester. "I can see the target area clearly. The cathedral spires are visible against the firelight, and I can identify several of our primary targets." Price was a meticulous young man from Cardiff who had joined the crew just 2 months earlier, replacing their previous bomb aimer who had been killed during a raid on Hamburg. His precision with the bomb sight had already proven invaluable, and Morrison trusted his judgment completely. "Roger, bomb aimer, take your time and get it right." The next few minutes would determine whether their 6-hour flight and the risks they had taken to reach this point would be worthwhile. Morrison steadied the aircraft on its bombing run, trying to maintain a straight and level course, despite the anti-aircraft fire that was now bursting uncomfortably close to their position. Below them, Cologne was burning. The ancient spires of Cologne Cathedral rose like ghostly sentinels through the smoke and flame that was beginning to engulf the city below. Flight Lieutenant Morrison held the Manchester steady on its bombing approach, fighting the aircraft's tendency to drift in the turbulent air created by the fires burning throughout the urban landscape. The distinctive twin towers of the cathedral which had dominated the Cologne skyline for centuries, now served as navigation markers for the stream of Allied bombers converging on their target. "Bomb aimer to pilot," Sergeant Price's voice was steady, despite the circumstances. "I have the cathedral in sight. Coming left 2 degrees to line up on the marshalling yards. The railway lines are clearly visible in the firelight." Morrison made the slight course correction, his hands firm on the controls, despite the flak bursts that were now appearing with alarming frequency around their aircraft. Each black puff of smoke marked where an 88mm shell had exploded, sending deadly fragments of steel through the space where bombers might be flying. The German gunners were getting uncomfortably accurate, their radar-directed fire concentrating on the altitude bands where the majority of the attacking aircraft were operating. Below them, the first wave of Operation Millennium had already begun its work. Fires burned throughout the city centre, their orange glow providing an eerie illumination that made navigation both easier and more terrifying. Morrison could see the River Rhine cutting through the city like a silver ribbon, its surface reflecting the flames that were consuming the buildings along its banks. The Hohenzollern Bridge, a vital railway link that was one of their primary targets, was clearly visible in the firelight. "Navigator to crew," Flying Officer Stevens announced over the intercom. "We are now 3 minutes from our planned release point. All crew members should prepare for the bombing run." The preparation ritual was familiar to Morrison's crew, though it never became routine. Each man had specific responsibilities during the critical minutes when they would be most vulnerable to enemy action. Flight Sergeant Matthews in the rear turret was scanning the sky for German night fighters, his 4.303 machine guns loaded and ready. Sergeant Harrison monitored the radio frequencies, listening for fighter warnings from other aircraft in the stream, while maintaining communication with their base back in England. Morrison could hear the steady drone of other aircraft around them, though in the darkness and smoke it was difficult to see more than the occasional navigation light or engine exhaust. The concentration of bombers over the target area was unlike anything attempted before in the war, with aircraft from Bomber Command, Training Command, and Coastal Command all converging on Cologne within a 90-minute window. The scale of the operation was beginning to manifest itself in the intensity of the fires below. What had started as scattered blazes from the first wave of attackers was now developing into a conflagration that threatened to engulf entire districts of the city. Morrison found himself thinking about the civilian population below, the families who were probably huddled in air raid shelters or cellars, waiting for the terror to pass. But such thoughts were dangerous during an operation. His responsibility was to his crew and to the successful completion of their mission. "Bomb doors open," Price reported, his voice carrying over the increased noise as the aircraft's bomb bay doors swung down into the slipstream. The Manchester shuddered slightly as the aerodynamics changed, requiring Morrison to make small adjustments to maintain their heading and altitude. The anti-aircraft fire was intensifying as more German batteries joined the defensive barrage. Morrison could see muzzle flashes from gun positions throughout the city and its surrounding areas, each one representing another threat to the hundreds of bombers that were now approaching or over the target. Occasionally, a bomber would be caught in the searchlights, becoming visible as a dark silhouette against the brilliant white beams that tracked its movement across the sky. "Christ, look at that," Matthews called from the rear turret. "Bomber going down at 2 o'clock low." Morrison glanced briefly in the direction indicated and saw an aircraft trailing fire from one wing, beginning the characteristic spiral that marked a machine in its death throes. Whether the crew would have time to escape was impossible to determine from their altitude, but Morrison forced himself to concentrate on his own aircraft and crew. Every second of distraction could prove fatal in the deadly airspace over Cologne. The city below was now clearly visible in detail despite the smoke and confusion. Morrison could make out individual streets and buildings, many of them already burning or damaged by the bombs from earlier waves. The industrial areas along the Rhine were particular focuses of attention, with several large fires marking where high explosive bombs had found their targets among the chemical plants and manufacturing facilities that made Cologne such an important objective for Bomber Command. "Steady as she goes, Skipper," Price called. "I can see the target clearly now. The main railway yards are directly ahead, with several trains visible in the sidings. This should be a good one." Morrison maintained his course, fighting the natural urge to take evasive action as flak bursts appeared around them. The bombing run required absolute precision, with any deviation likely to result in their bombs falling on unintended targets. The Manchester was flying at approximately 160 miles per hour, making them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, but ensuring the accuracy that was essential for the success of their mission. The sound of other aircraft was now clearly audible, even over their own engines, as dozens of bombers converged on the target area simultaneously. Morrison caught glimpses of other Manchesters, Wellingtons, Hamptons, and even some of the older Whitley bombers that had been pressed into service for this massive operation. The sight of so many aircraft operating together was both reassuring and alarming. Reassuring because it demonstrated the scale of the Allied commitment to the bombing campaign. Alarming because the potential for mid-air collisions was enormous. "Flak burst dead ahead," Harrison called out, and Morrison saw the black puff of smoke appear directly in their flight path. He held course, knowing that any deviation now would compromise their bombing accuracy. The steel fragments from the anti-aircraft shell whistled past their aircraft, some striking the fuselage with metallic impacts that could be heard even over the engine noise. Price was now hunched over his bomb sight, making the final calculations that would determine where their 4,000-pound bombs and 18 incendiaries would fall. The Norden bomb sight was a precision instrument, but its effectiveness depended entirely on the steadiness of the aircraft and the skill of the bomb aimer. Price had demonstrated both qualities during their previous operations, and Morrison trusted him completely. The fires below were now so intense that they created their own weather, with columns of smoke and superheated air rising to their altitude and beyond. Morrison could feel the Manchester being buffeted by the thermal currents, requiring constant small corrections to maintain their bombing attitude. The smell of smoke was beginning to penetrate the aircraft's cabin, an acrid reminder of the destruction being unleashed on the city below. 30 seconds to release, Price announced, his voice calm and professional, despite the chaos around them. Morrison could see tracer fire rising from ground positions, the coloured streams of bullets arcing up toward the bomber formations. Most of it fell short of their altitude, but occasionally a line of tracers would pass close enough to be visible through the cockpit windows. Squadron Leader Davies's briefing from earlier in the evening had emphasised the importance of concentration, getting the maximum number of aircraft over the target in the minimum time to overwhelm the German defences and maximise the destructive effect. Looking around at the number of aircraft visible in the target area, Morrison could see that this objective was being achieved, though at considerable cost to the attacking force. "Bomb aimer to pilot, I can see a stick of bombs from another aircraft impacting in the railway yards. Direct hits on what appears to be a locomotive depot. The secondary explosions suggest we may have hit fuel or ammunition storage." Morrison nodded, though Price couldn't see him from his position in the nose. The intelligence briefings had indicated that Cologne was a major transportation hub, with extensive railway facilities that were used to move German military supplies throughout Western Europe. Destroying these facilities would have a significant impact on German logistics, justifying the risks being taken by the hundreds of aircrew now over the target. The Manchester was now approaching the critical point where Price would release their bomb load. Morrison maintained steady pressure on the controls, compensating for the air currents while keeping the aircraft as level as possible. Any movement of the aircraft during the bomb release could scatter their weapons across a wide area, reducing their effectiveness and potentially causing unnecessary civilian casualties. 10 seconds, Price called. Morrison could feel the tension throughout the aircraft, as his crew prepared for the moment of release. In the rear turret, Matthews was still scanning for enemy fighters. Knowing that German night fighters often attacked bombers during their bombing runs when they were most vulnerable and least able to take evasive action. The first indication that German night fighters were active in the area came from another aircraft in their formation. Night fighter attacking from starboard. The transmission was cut short, but Morrison caught a glimpse of tracer fire and what appeared to be an explosion several hundred yards to their right. "Keep watching, lads," Morrison called to his crew. "Jerry's up there somewhere." The German night fighter tactics had evolved considerably since the early days of the war. Instead of the single-engine fighters that had initially been used for night interception, the Luftwaffe was now deploying twin-engine aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-110 and Junkers Ju-88, equipped with radar and armed with cannons and machine guns, specifically designed for attacking bombers. These aircraft were directed to the bomber streams by ground-based radar, then used their own airborne radar to close in for the kill. "Bombs gone," Price announced suddenly, and Morrison felt the Manchester lift slightly as 4 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs fell away toward the city below. The bomb doors began to close automatically, reducing the drag on the aircraft and improving their speed for the escape from the target area. Bomb aimer to pilot, I observed our bombs falling toward the railway yards. Several direct hits on the tracks and what appeared to be rolling stock. Secondary fires started immediately from the incendiaries. Morrison began a gentle turn to port, taking them away from the target area and toward their planned route home. Around them, other aircraft were making similar turns, the bomber stream beginning to disperse as individual crews sought the safest path back to England. The concentration that had been so important over the target now became a liability, as German night fighters would continue to hunt the returning bombers throughout their journey across occupied Europe. The view below as they turned away from Cologne was both spectacular and horrifying. The entire city centre appeared to be burning, with fires visible from the cathedral area to the industrial districts along the Rhine. Individual blazes had merged into a firestorm that was creating its own wind patterns, feeding on itself and spreading beyond the areas that had been directly attacked. Pilot Officer Chen, whose navigation skills Morrison had heard praised in the briefing, was flying somewhere in the formation around them. Morrison wondered how Chen was handling his first major operation, remembering his own nervousness during early missions over enemy territory. The young pilot's concerns about moon conditions had proved well-founded. The bright moonlight that made navigation easier also made them clearly visible to German gunners and night fighter pilots. "Navigator to pilot," Stevens called. "Recommend new heading of 285 degrees to take us clear of the Ruhr defensive area. Intelligence reports indicate heavy night fighter activity along the direct route home." Morrison acknowledged and made the course change, noting that fuel consumption had been higher than expected due to the strong headwinds they had encountered en route to the target. The return journey would need to be carefully managed to ensure they had sufficient fuel to reach England, particularly if they encountered any problems that required diversions or extended flight time. The radio frequency assigned to the operation continued to crackle with transmissions from other aircraft. Some reported successful bombing runs and were beginning their return journey. Others called for assistance, damaged aircraft trying to reach neutral territory, crews reporting engine failures or battle damage, requests for emergency bearings to the nearest friendly airfield. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Hampton Charlie Peter 7. We have taken flak damage and are losing altitude. Engines running rough. Anyone in the vicinity, please respond." Morrison listened to the distress call, knowing that there was little he could do to help. The protocols for such situations were clear. Individual aircraft could not break formation or deviate from their planned routes to assist others without endangering their own crews and missions. The mathematics of aerial warfare were harsh but unavoidable. Flight Sergeant Matthews called from the rear turret. "Skipper, I'm seeing a lot of activity behind us. Looks like Jerry's really stirring up trouble for the later waves." Looking back toward Cologne, Morrison could see what Matthews meant. The anti-aircraft fire was now more intense than when they had been over the target, and there were several aircraft visible in the searchlight beams. The German defences were fully alert and actively engaging the continuing stream of bombers still approaching the target area. The success of Operation Millennium would depend not just on the number of aircraft that reached Cologne, but on the concentration of the attack and the accuracy of the bombing. From what Morrison had observed during their time over the target, both objectives appeared to be achieved. The fires burning throughout the city indicated that a significant number of bombs had found their targets, and the continuous stream of aircraft had maintained the concentration that Air Chief Marshal Harris had deemed essential for success. "Wireless operator to pilot," Harrison called. "I'm picking up German radio transmissions on the night fighter frequency. Sounds like they're vectoring fighters toward the bomber stream. Recommend we maintain radio silence and keep a sharp lookout." Morrison acknowledged the warning and passed it on to his crew. The German night fighter control system had become increasingly sophisticated, using ground-based radar to track the bomber formations and direct interceptors to optimal attack positions. Once the fighters made contact with the bomber stream, they could follow it for hundreds of miles, picking off aircraft one by one during the long flight back to England. The landscape below them was now showing less evidence of the massive attack that was still continuing behind them. They had crossed into what Morrison estimated was the Dutch border area. Though positive identification was difficult in the moonlight, the flat terrain and network of canals suggested they were over the Netherlands, but navigation in wartime Europe was complicated by the blackout conditions that concealed most of the normal landmarks. Stevens provided regular updates on their position and fuel consumption, calculating their estimated time of arrival back at RAF Wickenby. "Navigator to pilot, at current speed and heading, we should cross the English coast at approximately 0430 hours. Fuel consumption is higher than planned, but we should have adequate reserves for a normal landing." The mention of fuel reserves reminded Morrison of one of the critical limitations of the Manchester bomber. The twin Rolls-Royce Vulture engines were powerful but thirsty, and the aircraft's range was more limited than some of the other types in Bomber Command's inventory. Several crews had been lost over the North Sea during previous operations when fuel ran out before they could reach England. "Rear gunner to pilot," Matthews called, his voice tense. "I think we may have company. There's an aircraft following us about a mile back, maintaining our heading and altitude." Morrison felt his stomach tighten. German night fighters often followed bomber formations for extended periods, studying their defensive formations and waiting for an opportunity to attack. The Luftwaffe pilots had learned that patience was often more effective than aggressive tactics, allowing them to pick off stragglers or aircraft that had been separated from the main formation. "Can you identify the type?" Morrison asked. "Negative, skipper. Too far back and the exhaust flames aren't distinctive enough. Could be one of ours, but the spacing suggests it might be a night fighter." Morrison considered his options. If it was a German night fighter, taking evasive action might trigger an attack. If it was another Allied bomber, sudden manoeuvres could cause a mid-air collision. The safest course was to maintain heading and altitude while keeping the suspected aircraft under close observation. "All crew, keep watching that aircraft. If it closes the distance or makes any threatening moves, I want to know immediately." The tension in the aircraft was palpable as Morrison's crew maintained their watch on the unidentified aircraft trailing behind them. In the rear turret, Matthews had his guns trained on the contact, ready to open fire if it proved hostile. Harrison monitored the radio frequencies for any warnings from other aircraft in the area. Minutes passed slowly as they continued their course toward the Dutch coast. The aircraft behind them maintained its position, neither closing the distance nor falling back. Morrison began to hope that it might be another bomber following the same route home, perhaps with navigation equipment problems that made it advisable to follow another aircraft. "Navigator to pilot," Stevens called. "We should be approaching the enemy coast shortly. Recommend descending to 8,000 feet to stay below the radar coverage of the coastal defences." Morrison began a gradual descent, noting that the aircraft behind them matched his altitude change. This behaviour was somewhat reassuring, as a German night fighter would be more likely to maintain altitude for an attack rather than following their descent profile so precisely. The Dutch coast appeared ahead of them as a thin line of white where waves broke against the beaches. Morrison could see searchlights sweeping the sky, and occasionally the flash of anti-aircraft fire directed at other aircraft in the bomber stream. The German coastal defences had been reinforced significantly since the beginning of the war, with radar stations and gun batteries positioned to intercept Allied aircraft crossing to and from operations over occupied Europe. "Coastal defences active ahead, Morrison announced to his crew. "We'll be crossing the coast in approximately 5 minutes. Stay alert for flak and searchlights." The aircraft that had been following them was no longer visible, having apparently turned away or been lost in the darkness. Morrison felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, though the danger was far from over. The North Sea crossing would take nearly an hour, and German night fighters were known to patrol the sea approaches to England, hunting for damaged or fuel-short bombers struggling to reach home. As they crossed the Dutch coast, Morrison caught sight of another bomber being held in a cone of searchlights. The aircraft was clearly visible against the brilliant white beams, and he could see flak bursts appearing around it as the German gunners concentrated their fire. The bomber was taking evasive action, diving and turning to escape the lights, but seemed unable to break free from the illumination. "Poor bastards," Harrison muttered over the intercom, voicing what they were all thinking. Morrison maintained course and altitude, knowing that any deviation to help the trapped aircraft would only make his own crew more vulnerable to the defences. The harsh realities of bomber operations meant that each crew was essentially on its own once they entered enemy airspace. The North Sea stretched ahead of them, a vast expanse of dark water broken only by the phosphorescent wakes of ships and the occasional flash of a lighthouse. Morrison settled into the routine of the long overwater flight, monitoring his instruments and fuel consumption, while Stevens provided regular navigation updates. "Navigator to pilot, our track over the sea is taking us slightly north of the planned route. Recommend adjusting heading to 275 degrees to compensate for wind drift." Morrison made the course correction, noting that the wind conditions had changed since their outbound flight. This was not unusual over the North Sea, where weather could change rapidly and without warning. The important thing was to maintain an accurate navigation plot to ensure they made landfall at the correct point on the English coast. The fuel gauges were showing consumption rates that were higher than ideal, but still within acceptable limits. Morrison calculated that they should have sufficient reserves to reach RAF Wickenby, though there would be little margin for error if they encountered problems during the approach and landing. Behind them, the glow on the horizon marked where Cologne was still burning. Even at their distance from the target, the fires were visible as an orange smudge against the night sky. Morrison found himself wondering about the effectiveness of the raid and the cost in Allied aircrew. The operation had been unprecedented in scale, but whether it would achieve the strategic objectives that Air Chief Marshal Harris had set remained to be seen. "Rear gunner to crew," Matthews called. "I can see aircraft lights behind us. Looks like other bombers from the operation heading home." The sight of other Allied aircraft was reassuring, providing some confirmation that they were on the correct route and that other crews had successfully completed their missions over Cologne. Morrison could see navigation lights from several aircraft spread across the sky behind them, all heading generally westward toward England. The radio began to crackle with transmissions from aircraft approaching the English coast. Some were reporting normal returns with no problems, while others were calling for emergency assistance. Morrison listened carefully to the emergency frequencies, knowing that any aircraft in serious trouble would need priority handling by air traffic control. Mayday, Mayday. This is Wellington Fox Uncle Mike. We have wounded aboard and damage to port engine, requesting priority landing at nearest available field. Roger, Fox Uncle Mike. You are cleared for emergency approach to RAF Cultishall. Runway 08 is available. Emergency services standing by. Such exchanges reminded Morrison of the human cost of the night's operations. Behind each radio call was a crew that had faced the same dangers he and his men had encountered, but had been less fortunate in avoiding the German defences. Stevens announced that they were approaching the English coast, and Morrison could see the familiar outline of the Norfolk shoreline ahead. The sight of England, after 6 hours over enemy territory, never failed to provide a sense of relief, though they were not yet safely home. Navigator to pilot. Recommend contacting base for landing instructions. We should be back at Wickenby in approximately 30 minutes. Morrison keyed his radio transmitter. Wickenby Control. This is Manchester Baker 72 requesting landing instructions. Baker 72, this is Wickenby Control. You are cleared for normal approach to runway 27. Wind is light and variable. Visibility good. Welcome home? The familiar voice of the control tower operator was one of the most welcome sounds Morrison had heard all night. RAF Wickenby was home to the 12th Squadron, and the ground crew would be waiting to service their aircraft and debrief the crew on their mission results. As they approached the circuit pattern for landing, Morrison could see other aircraft ahead of them in the approach sequence. The airfield was busier than usual, with bombers from the Cologne operation returning throughout the early morning hours. Ground crews would be working continuously to turn the aircraft around for potential operations the following night. The landing approach was routine, though Morrison found himself concentrating more carefully than usual on the familiar procedures. The tension and stress of the 6-hour mission had taken their toll, and he was looking forward to the debriefing and the opportunity to rest before their next operation. The Manchester touched down smoothly on RAF Wickenby's main runway, the familiar bump and roll of the landing gear making contact with English soil. Morrison taxied clear of the runway and followed the marshaller's signals to their designated parking area, where Chief Technician Williams and his ground crew were waiting to receive the aircraft. As Morrison shut down the engines, the sudden silence was almost overwhelming after 6 hours of constant engine noise. His crew began their post-flight checks and prepared to leave the aircraft, each man dealing with the stress and relief of completing another operation in his own way. The debriefing would come next, followed by the traditional post-operation meal and the opportunity to rest before their next mission. But for now, they were safely back at RAF Wickenby, having contributed their part to the largest bombing operation in history. Morrison climbed down from the cockpit and stood for a moment beside his aircraft, looking back toward the east where the first hints of dawn were beginning to appear on the horizon. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Cologne was still burning, and the assessment of Operation Millennium's success would depend on intelligence reports and reconnaissance photographs that would be analysed in the coming days. But for Flight Lieutenant Morrison and the crew of Manchester R5830, the mission was complete. They had flown to the heart of Nazi Germany, delivered their bombs on target, and brought their aircraft and crew safely home. In the arithmetic of aerial warfare, this constituted success regardless of the broader strategic implications of the night's operations. The ground crew began their inspection of the aircraft, looking for battle damage and preparing R5830 for its next mission. Morrison gathered his flying gear and began the walk back to the squadron offices, where Squadron Leader Davies would be waiting to hear their report on the most ambitious bombing operation yet attempted by the Royal Air Force. The debriefing room at RAF Wickenby was thick with cigarette smoke, and the lingering smell of aviation fuel that seemed to cling to every aircrew member returning from operations. Flight Lieutenant Morrison sat at one of the long wooden tables, nursing a cup of strong tea while waiting for his turn with the intelligence officers. Around him, other crews from the 12th Squadron were going through the same ritual, their voices subdued as they recounted the events of the past 6 hours over Cologne. The large clock on the wall showed 05:47 hours. Dawn was breaking over Lincolnshire, painting the sky beyond the blackout curtains in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost surreal after the hellish orange glow they had witnessed over the burning German city. Morrison found himself staring at his hands, noting the slight tremor that always appeared after particularly intense operations. The tremor would fade within an hour or two, but it served as a physical reminder of the stress his body had endured during the mission. Squadron Leader Davies moved between the tables, speaking quietly with each crew as they completed their individual debriefings. His face showed the strain of commanding a squadron through the largest bombing operation in history, but there was also something that might have been satisfaction in his expression. The preliminary report suggested that Operation Millennium had achieved its primary objectives, though the full assessment would not be available for several days. "Morrison," Davies called, approaching their table. "How did it go out there?" Morrison straightened slightly, organising his thoughts. "We reached the target on schedule, sir. Price got good bomb site pictures of the railway yards, and we observed direct hits on what appeared to be locomotive sheds and rolling stock. The fires were already well established when we arrived, and they seemed to be spreading rapidly throughout the city centre." Davies nodded, making notes on his clipboard. "Any problems with the aircraft or crew?" "Nothing serious, sir. We had a possible contact on the return journey that might have been a night fighter, but it didn't close to attack. Fuel consumption was higher than planned due to headwinds, but we had adequate reserves for a normal landing." "Good show," Davies replied. "Get some rest, and we'll have a full squadron briefing at 1400 hours. There may be reconnaissance photographs available by then." As Davies moved on to the next crew, Morrison found himself reflecting on the night's events. The scale of Operation Millennium had been unlike anything he had experienced in his 8 months of operational flying. The sight of so many aircraft converging on a single target, the intensity of the fires burning throughout Cologne, and the concentrated defensive response from the German flak batteries and night fighters had combined to create something that seemed almost beyond the normal experience of aerial warfare. Flying Officer Stevens, his navigator, was completing the detailed flight log that would become part of the official record of the operation. Stevens was methodical in all things, and his precise notations of course changes, fuel consumption, and timing would provide valuable data for future operations. "The winds were definitely stronger than forecast," Stevens was saying to the intelligence officer. "We had to make several course corrections to maintain our track, and it affected our fuel consumption throughout the mission." Sergeant Harrison, their wireless operator, was describing the radio traffic he had monitored during the operation. "There was a lot of distress traffic on the emergency frequencies," Harrison reported. "Several aircraft reported battle damage or engine problems, and I heard at least 3 mayday calls from crews going down over enemy territory." The intelligence officer, Flight Lieutenant Cooper, made careful notes of Harrison's observations. The radio intercepts would be collated with similar reports from other crews to build a comprehensive picture of the night's losses and the effectiveness of German defensive measures. Such information was vital for planning future operations and improving the survival chances of bomber crews. Morrison's bomb aimer, Sergeant Price, was providing detailed information about their bombing results. "The target was clearly illuminated by fires from the first wave," Price explained. "I could see the cathedral spires distinctly and used them as a reference point for identifying the railway yards. Our bombs appeared to fall directly on target, with several impacts observed on locomotive sheds and what looked like fuel storage tanks." Price's precision with the bomb sight had been evident throughout their operational tour, and Morrison was confident that their weapons had been delivered accurately. The young Welshman approached each mission with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized his peacetime work as a surveyor, treating the destruction of enemy targets as a technical problem to be solved rather than dwelling on the human consequences of their actions. In the rear turret position throughout the mission, Flight Sergeant Matthews had maintained watch for German night fighters while observing the defensive activity around the target. "The flak was heavier than anything I've seen before," Matthews told the intelligence officer. "They seemed to have guns positioned all around the city, and the coordination between the searchlights and the anti-aircraft batteries was very good. I saw at least 2 bombers caught in searchlight cones and engaged by concentrated flak." Matthews was a steady, reliable man whose farming background in Yorkshire had given him the patience and observational skills that made him an excellent rear gunner. His ability to remain calm under fire had already saved their aircraft on several occasions, and Morrison valued his judgment highly. The debriefing process continued for another hour, as each crew member provided his perspective on the night's operation. The intelligence officers were particularly interested in any observations about German defensive tactics, the effectiveness of the bombing concentration, and the behaviour of enemy night fighters. All of this information would be compiled into reports that would reach Air Chief Marshal Harris and the senior commanders responsible for planning future operations. As the formal debriefing concluded, Morrison and his crew made their way to the mess hall for the traditional post-operation meal. The bacon and eggs served after operations had become a ritual that marked the successful completion of another mission, though Morrison's appetite was never particularly strong immediately after returning from enemy territory. The mess hall was busier than usual, with crews from the Cologne operation joining others who had returned from training flights or other duties. The conversation was animated but subdued, with aircrew sharing their experiences of the massive raid while being careful not to reveal classified information about tactics or results. At a corner table, Morrison recognized several pilots from other squadrons who had participated in Operation Millennium. Flight Lieutenant Parker from the 50th Squadron was describing his crew's experience over the target. "The concentration was incredible," Parker was saying. "I've never seen so many aircraft in one area before. The coordination worked better than I expected, though there were some close calls with aircraft at similar altitudes." Squadron Leader Turnbull from 44 Squadron nodded in agreement. "The fires were visible from 50 miles away on our approach. By the time we reached the target area, the entire city centre seemed to be burning. It was unlike anything I've witnessed in 2 years of operations." Morrison joined their conversation, adding his own observations about the intensity of the German defences and the apparent success of the bombing concentration. The sharing of experiences was an important part of the process of absorbing the psychological impact of such operations, allowing aircrew to place their individual experiences in the broader context of the night's events. "What struck me," Morrison said, "was how well the German defences responded to such a large-scale attack. They seemed to adapt quickly to the concentration of aircraft, and their night fighters were active throughout our return journey." Parker nodded grimly. "We lost at least 3 aircraft from our squadron alone. One went down over the target area, caught in searchlights, and hit by flak. Another was attacked by a night fighter over Holland and never made it back. The third developed engine problems and had to ditch in the North Sea." Such losses were the inevitable cost of operations against heavily defended targets, but they never became routine for the men who flew these missions. Each aircraft lost represented 7 men: pilot, navigator, bomb aimer, wireless operator, flight engineer, and 2 gunners, who would not be returning to their families or continuing their part in the war effort. Morrison found himself thinking about the crew of the aircraft he had seen going down in flames over Cologne. 7 young men, probably not much different from himself and his crew, who had volunteered for aircrew duty and trained for months to participate in operations like tonight's raid. Whether any of them had survived to become prisoners of war was impossible to know, but the statistics of bomber operations suggested that most would have perished with their aircraft. The conversation gradually turned to technical matters: fuel consumption rates, the performance of different aircraft types during the operation, and observations about German defensive tactics. Flight Lieutenant Chen, the young pilot whose navigation concerns Morrison remembered from the briefing, had apparently completed his first major operation successfully, though his aircraft had suffered minor flak damage during the bombing run. The moon conditions made navigation easier, Chen was explaining to another pilot, but they also made us sitting ducks for the flak batteries. I could see our aircraft clearly silhouetted against the sky, and I'm sure the German gunners could see us just as well. Such observations would be valuable for planning future operations, particularly regarding the optimal balance between visibility for navigation and concealment from enemy defences. The lessons learned during Operation Millennium would influence bomber tactics for months to come. As the morning progressed, more crews continued to arrive back at their bases throughout eastern England. Some had encountered severe problems: engine failures, battle damage, or fuel shortages that forced emergency landings at unfamiliar airfields. Others had been attacked by night fighters or damaged by flak, but had managed to complete their missions and return safely home. Morrison made his way to his quarters in the officers' accommodation block, a simple room with a bed, desk, and wardrobe that had been his home for the past 6 months. The contrast between the Spartan military accommodations and the comfortable civilian life he had known before the war was stark, but such comparisons seemed increasingly irrelevant as the conflict continued. Sleep did not come easily after operations. The combination of physical exhaustion and mental stimulation from 6 hours of intense concentration over enemy territory often left aircrew in a state where rest was difficult, despite their fatigue. Morrison lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying the events of the night in his mind. The image of Cologne burning remained vivid in his memory, the ancient cathedral, which had dominated the city's skyline for centuries, silhouetted against the orange glow of countless fires. The methodical precision with which Price had lined up their bombing run, treating the destruction of a major German city as a technical problem to be solved. The steady voice of Stevens providing navigation updates as they flew deeper into enemy territory. Such thoughts were part of the psychological cost of bomber operations, the burden that every aircrew carried as they participated in the systematic destruction of enemy targets. The strategic justification for such operations was clear. German industrial capacity had to be degraded to reduce their ability to continue the war. But the human cost, both to Allied aircrew and to German civilians, was equally real and could not be ignored. Morrison eventually drifted into a restless sleep, his dreams filled with images of burning cities and aircraft falling from night skies. Such dreams were common among bomber crews, the subconscious mind processing experiences that were beyond the normal range of human experience. Most aircrew learned to live with these psychological effects, though some found the burden too great and were withdrawn from operations with what was euphemistically termed lack of moral fibre. The afternoon briefing that Squadron Leader Davies had mentioned took place as scheduled at 1400 hours. The briefing room was packed with aircrew from the 12th Squadron, all eager to learn about the preliminary assessment of Operation Millennium's results. Davies stood at the front of the room, flanked by intelligence officers who had been analysing the night's operations. "Gentlemen," Davies began, "I can report that Operation Millennium appears to have been a significant success. Over 1,040 aircraft participated in the operation, making it the largest bombing raid in history. Preliminary reconnaissance indicates extensive damage throughout Cologne, with particular success against railway installations, industrial areas, and communication centres." The room stirred with quiet satisfaction at this news. The risks they had all taken during the night appeared to have been justified by the results achieved. Davies continued with more specific details about the bombing results and the cost of the operation. Our losses were lighter than anticipated for an operation of this scale. 41 aircraft failed to return, representing approximately 4% of the attacking force. This compares favourably with recent operations against similar targets using conventional force levels. Morrison did the arithmetic quickly in his head. 41 aircraft meant approximately 280 aircrew killed, wounded, or missing, a significant number in human terms, but relatively light considering the scale of the operation and the strength of German defences around Cologne. The intelligence officers provided more detailed information about the observed results of the bombing. Reconnaissance photographs taken later in the day showed extensive damage throughout the city centre, with particular destruction in the industrial areas along the Rhine. Several major railway yards had been severely damaged, and fires were still burning in multiple locations more than 12 hours after the attack. The concentration of the attack appears to have overwhelmed German defensive measures, one of the intelligence officers reported. While flak and night fighter activity was intense, the sheer number of aircraft over the target area made it impossible for the defences to engage effectively with all of the attacking force. This assessment confirmed Morrison's observations during the mission. The German defences had responded aggressively to the attack, but they had been unable to prevent the majority of the bombers from reaching their targets and delivering their weapons accurately. Davies concluded the briefing with information about future operations. The success of Operation Millennium demonstrates the effectiveness of concentrated bombing attacks against major German targets. Similar operations are being planned, and the 12th Squadron will continue to play a vital role in Bomber Command's strategic offensive. As the crews filed out of the briefing room, Morrison found himself in conversation with several other pilots about the implications of the night's success. The demonstration that such large-scale operations were feasible suggested that the strategic bombing campaign would continue to expand, with increasingly ambitious targets and larger forces committed to each operation. The Americans are talking about daylight precision bombing, Flight Lieutenant Parker mentioned as they walked toward the mess hall. If we can achieve this kind of concentration at night, imagine what they might accomplish with their flying fortresses in daylight. Morrison nodded, though he had reservations about the feasibility of large-scale daylight operations over heavily defended German territory. The Luftwaffe's fighter defences were formidable, and daylight attacks would face challenges that were different from, but potentially more severe than those encountered during night operations. The days following Operation Millennium brought a steady stream of intelligence reports and reconnaissance photographs that provided a detailed picture of the raid's effectiveness. The damage to Cologne was indeed extensive, with industrial production significantly disrupted and transportation networks severely affected. The psychological impact on German civilian morale was also considerable, though this was more difficult to quantify through conventional intelligence sources. Morrison continued his normal routine of training flights, aircraft maintenance, and preparation for future operations. The success of the Cologne raid had demonstrated the potential of concentrated bombing attacks, but it had also shown the continuing dangers faced by bomber crews operating over heavily defended targets. 3 days after Operation Millennium, Morrison received a letter from his parents in Somerset. His mother's elegant handwriting covered 2 pages with news from home, the progress of her victory garden, her work with the Women's Voluntary Service, and village gossip that seemed increasingly remote from his current existence. She mentioned almost casually that young Robert Fletcher had been confirmed killed in action, his aircraft having been shot down over Germany with no survivors. Morrison folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer with the others he had received during his operational tour. The news about Robert Fletcher was not unexpected. Missing aircrew were rarely found alive after more than a few days, but it served as another reminder of the human cost of the bombing campaign. The village of his childhood, with its ancient church and peaceful countryside, seemed to exist in a different world from the one he now inhabited. The contrast between his mother's concerns about rationing and garden pests and his own experiences over burning German cities was so complete that it was sometimes difficult to believe they were part of the same reality. A week after the Cologne raid, Morrison was summoned to Squadron Leader Davies's office for what turned out to be a discussion about his future operational career. Davies was reviewing the files of his most experienced aircrew, evaluating who might be ready for promotion or transfer to other duties. "Morrison, you've completed 23 operations now, including last week's show over Cologne," Davies said, consulting the file on his desk. "Your crew has performed consistently well, and your aircraft return rate is above squadron average. Have you given any thought to what you'd like to do after completing your tour?" The standard operational tour for bomber aircrew was 30 missions, after which they were typically transferred to training duties or other non-operational roles. Morrison had been trying not to think too much about the 7 remaining operations he needed to complete, focusing instead on each mission as it came. "I hadn't really considered it, sir," Morrison replied honestly. "I suppose I've been concentrating on getting through the current tour first." Davies nodded understanding. "That's probably wise, but it's worth thinking about your options. You could apply for a permanent commission and remain with the squadron in a command role. Or you might consider a transfer to training command, where your operational experience would be valuable for preparing new crews." Morrison promised to consider the options, though privately he found it difficult to imagine a future beyond his current operational tour. The psychological focus required for bomber operations tended to narrow one's perspective to the immediate challenges of survival and mission completion, making long-term planning seem almost irrelevant. The conversation with Davies made Morrison more aware of his position as one of the more experienced aircrew on the squadron. New crews continued to arrive regularly, replacing those who had been lost or completed their tours, and Morrison found himself increasingly looked to for advice and guidance by the younger aircrew. Flying Officer Chen, whose first major operation had been the Cologne raid, sought Morrison out several times for discussions about operational techniques and survival tactics. Chen's concerns about moon conditions and defensive measures showed the kind of thoughtful analysis that Morrison hoped would help the young pilot survive his operational tour. "The thing I found most difficult," Chen confided during one such conversation, "was maintaining concentration during the bombing run while the flak was bursting around us. Every instinct told me to take evasive action, but I knew that would compromise our bombing accuracy." Morrison nodded, remembering his own early struggles with the same dilemma. "It never gets completely comfortable," he admitted, "but you learn to trust your training and focus on the job at hand. The important thing is to remember that evasive action during the bombing run usually means your bombs will miss the target, making the whole mission pointless." Such conversations were part of the informal education system that existed within bomber squadrons, where experienced aircrew passed on their knowledge to newcomers who would soon face the same challenges over enemy territory. The learning curve was steep, and those who adapted quickly had a much better chance of survival. 2 weeks after Operation Millennium, Morrison participated in his 25th operation, a raid against submarine construction yards in Hamburg. The target was heavily defended, and his aircraft suffered minor flak damage during the bombing run, but they completed their mission successfully and returned safely to RAF Wickenby. As his operational tour neared completion, Morrison found himself reflecting more frequently on the experiences of the past 8 months. He had participated in raids against targets throughout occupied Europe, industrial cities in the Ruhr Valley, submarine bases on the French coast, aircraft factories in central Germany, and transportation hubs in the Low Countries. Each operation had presented unique challenges and dangers, from the concentrated flak defences around major German cities to the threat of night fighters during the long flights across occupied territory. He had seen aircraft shot down by enemy action, lost to mechanical failures, or forced to ditch in the North Sea when fuel ran short. The transformation from the peacetime solicitor's son from Somerset to an experienced bomber pilot had been gradual but complete. The technical skills of navigation, bomb aiming, and aircraft handling had become second nature, but the psychological adaptation to the realities of aerial warfare had been more complex. Morrison had learned to compartmentalize his emotions, focusing on the technical aspects of each mission while avoiding too much reflection on the human consequences of their actions. The destruction they were inflicting on German cities was necessary for the war effort, but dwelling on the individual tragedies involved would have made it impossible to continue operating effectively. The crew with whom he had flown throughout his operational tour had become closer than family in many ways. Stevens, Harrison, Price, Matthews, and the others had shared experiences that were beyond the understanding of those who had not participated in bomber operations. The trust required to fly together into heavily defended enemy territory created bonds that Morrison knew would last for the rest of his life. As spring turned towards summer in 1942, the strategic bombing campaign continued to expand in scope and intensity. Operation Millennium had demonstrated the feasibility of 1,000-bomber raids, and similar operations were being planned against other major German targets. The RAF was growing rapidly, with new squadrons forming and new aircraft types entering service. Morrison's 28th operation took place on a clear night in early June, targeting aircraft factories in the industrial city of Essen. The Ruhr Valley was always heavily defended, but intelligence reports suggested that the target contained facilities critical to German fighter production. The operation was successful, though losses were heavier than usual due to the concentration of flak batteries and night fighters in the area. During the debriefing after the Essen raid, Morrison learned that Squadron Leader Davies was being promoted and transferred to Group Headquarters. Davies had commanded the 12th Squadron through some of its most challenging operations, including the historic Cologne raid, and his departure marked the end of an era for the unit. The new squadron leader who replaced Davies was Wing Commander James Peterson, a veteran of fighter operations during the Battle of Britain who had volunteered for transfer to Bomber Command. Peterson brought a different perspective to the squadron's operations, emphasizing tactical flexibility and crew survival as much as target destruction. "Gentlemen," Peterson announced during his first squadron briefing, "our primary mission remains the destruction of German industrial capacity through precision bombing, but I want to make it clear that getting you and your crews home safely is equally important. Dead heroes don't win wars, experienced aircrew do." Morrison appreciated this emphasis on survival, though he recognized that the fundamental dangers of bomber operations remained unchanged regardless of leadership philosophy. German defences continued to improve, and each mission over enemy territory carried significant risks that could not be eliminated through tactical modifications alone. His 29th operation was scheduled for mid-June, targeting submarine construction facilities at Bremen. The briefing indicated that intelligence sources had identified critical bottlenecks in German U-boat production at this facility, making it a high-priority target despite its heavy defences. The flight to Bremen followed a route similar to many Morrison had flown before, crossing the North Sea and entering German airspace over the Frisian Islands. The target area was partially obscured by industrial smoke, but Price managed to identify the submarine yards and deliver their bombs accurately, despite moderate flak opposition. The return journey was complicated by weather fronts moving across the North Sea, requiring careful navigation to avoid the worst of the storms while maintaining course toward England. Stevens's skill as a navigator was crucial during this phase of the flight, as radio beacons were unreliable and celestial navigation was impossible due to cloud cover. They landed at RAF Wickenby in deteriorating weather conditions, with rain beginning to fall as Morrison taxied the Manchester to its dispersal point. The successful completion of his 29th operation meant that only one mission remained before his operational tour would be complete. Wing Commander Peterson called Morrison to his office the following morning to discuss the final operation and his post-tour assignment. Peterson had reviewed Morrison's file and was impressed by his consistency and leadership qualities throughout the operational tour. "Morrison, I'd like you to consider remaining with the squadron as a flight commander," Peterson said. "Your experience would be valuable for training new crews, and frankly, we need experienced officers who understand the realities of operations over enemy territory." Morrison was flattered by the offer, but he requested time to consider the decision. The prospect of continuing operational flying beyond the standard 30-mission tour was daunting, though the opportunity to influence the training and survival of new aircrew was appealing. His 30th and final scheduled operation came in late June, targeting railway yards in the German city of Duisburg. The mission was routine by the standards Morrison had come to accept: moderate flak opposition, no night fighter contacts, and successful bomb delivery on target. As they turned away from the burning railway facilities and began the journey home, Morrison felt a mixture of relief and nostalgia for the operational flying that had defined his life for the past 8 months. The landing at RAF Wickenby was smooth, and the post-operation debriefing was brief. Morrison had completed his operational tour with a record that any aircrew would envy: 30 missions, over enemy territory, consistent bombing results, and no serious combat damage to his aircraft or injuries to his crew. As he walked back to his quarters in the early morning light, Morrison reflected on the transformation he had undergone since joining the 12th Squadron. The nervous young pilot who had flown his first operation 8 months earlier had been replaced by an experienced bomber captain whose skills and judgment had been tested repeatedly over the most heavily defended targets in occupied Europe. The decision about his future would need to be made soon, but for now, Morrison was content to have survived his operational tour and contributed to the strategic bombing campaign that was gradually weakening Germany's ability to continue the war. Operation Millennium and the other raids he had participated in were part of a larger effort that would ultimately help bring the conflict to a successful conclusion. The sun was rising over the Lincolnshire countryside as Morrison finally reached his quarters, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded him of peaceful mornings in Somerset before the war had changed everything. Soon, perhaps, such peaceful mornings would return, and the skills he had learned as a bomber pilot would no longer be needed. But until that day arrived, the strategic bombing campaign would continue, with new crews taking the places of those who had completed their tours or been lost to enemy action. The 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne had shown what could be achieved through concentration and determination, setting the pattern for operations that would eventually help bring Nazi Germany to its knees. Morrison opened the door to his quarters and prepared to rest, knowing that whatever decision he made about his future, he had played his part in one of the most significant campaigns of the Second World War. The memory of that night over Cologne, the sight of 1,000 bombers converging on a single target, the spectacle of an ancient city burning beneath a full moon, and the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished, would remain with him for the rest of his life. Operation Millennium: Outcomes and Impact. The smoke had barely cleared over Cologne when the reverberations of Operation Millennium began reshaping the entire trajectory of the Second World War. What Harris and the RAF had unleashed on the night of May 30th, 1942, was far more than a devastating air raid. It was the birth of a new kind of warfare that would fundamentally alter how nations approached total war. The immediate aftermath revealed a city transformed. Cologne, once a proud industrial and cultural centre of the Rhine, lay partially in ruins. Over 3,300 buildings were destroyed, with another 9,000 damaged. The psychological impact rippled through Germany like a shockwave. For the first time, ordinary German citizens experienced the full fury of Allied air power on their doorstep. The myth of German invincibility, carefully cultivated by Nazi propaganda, began to crack. But the true significance of Millennium lay not in the rubble of Cologne, but in what it represented: the emergence of strategic bombing as a decisive factor in modern warfare. Churchill and his war cabinet, previously sceptical of Bomber Command's capabilities, suddenly saw aircraft not just as tactical support weapons, but as instruments capable of striking at the very heart of enemy industrial capacity and civilian morale. The operation's success transformed Arthur Harris from a controversial figure into the architect of Britain's primary offensive strategy against Nazi Germany. The resources that had been flowing toward other theatres of war began redirecting toward Bomber Command. Aircraft production priorities shifted, crew training intensified, and the great build-up of the combined bomber offensive began in earnest. In Germany, the raid forced a fundamental recalculation of defensive strategy. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns that might have been deployed on the Eastern Front or in North Africa were now permanently stationed in German cities. Fighter aircraft were recalled from combat zones to defend the homeland. Most critically, the raid accelerated German research into radar technology and night fighting capabilities, diverting scientific resources from offensive weapons development. The psychological warfare aspect proved equally transformative. Goebbels' propaganda machine, which had successfully portrayed Germany as impregnable, now faced the impossible task of explaining why British bombers could devastate German cities with apparent impunity. The confidence of the German population, crucial for maintaining war production and morale, began its slow but inexorable decline. For the broader Allied strategy, Millennium validated the concept of opening a second front through the air. While Stalin continued demanding a ground invasion of Europe, Churchill could now point to the bombing campaign as Britain's significant contribution to relieving pressure on the Eastern Front. This aerial second front would ultimately draw substantial German resources away from other theatres, particularly the crucial battles in North Africa and the Eastern Front. The raid also marked a turning point in Anglo-American cooperation. The success of Millennium helped convince the Americans that strategic bombing could be decisive, leading to increased coordination between the RAF and the nascent US Army Air Forces. This collaboration would evolve into the combined bomber offensive, ultimately delivering far more devastating blows to German industry and morale than any single nation could have achieved alone. Perhaps most significantly, Operation Millennium established the template for the total war approach that would characterize the remainder of the conflict. The distinction between military and civilian targets began to blur as industrial capacity, transportation networks, and civilian morale became legitimate strategic objectives. This shift would culminate in the devastating campaigns against Hamburg, Dresden, and ultimately the atomic bombings of Japan. The economic impact on Germany was immediate and lasting. Cologne's industrial output plummeted, disrupting supply chains throughout the Reich. Insurance companies faced unprecedented claims, effectively socializing the cost of war damage across the German economy. Resources that should have gone toward military production were diverted to reconstruction and civil defense. The raid also accelerated technological development on both sides. German advances in radar, night fighting techniques, and air defense systems came in direct response to the threat posed by mass bombing raids. Similarly, Allied development of navigation aids, bombing techniques, and aircraft design was spurred by the lessons learned from Millennium. In the broader context of 1942, when German forces were advancing towards Stalingrad and threatening the Caucasus oil fields, Operation Millennium provided a crucial morale boost for Britain and its allies. It demonstrated that Germany could be hurt, that the war was not hopeless, and that British resolve remained unbroken despite years of struggle. The raid's impact extended beyond the immediate participants to neutral nations and potential allies. It signalled to the world that Britain retained the capacity for offensive action, potentially influencing countries considering their alignment in the global conflict. The demonstration of air power also foreshadowed the kind of warfare that would dominate future conflicts. As 1942 progressed into 1943, the precedent set by Operation Millennium enabled increasingly ambitious bombing campaigns. The raid had proven that large-scale strategic bombing was not only possible, but devastatingly effective. This realization shaped Allied strategy for the remainder of the war, ultimately contributing to Germany's defeat through the systematic destruction of its industrial capacity and the collapse of civilian morale. The 1,000 bombers over Cologne had not merely destroyed buildings, they had announced the arrival of a new era in warfare, one where entire nations, not just their armies, would bear the full weight of total war. The outcome of Operation Millennium thus extended far beyond a single night over a German city. It fundamentally altered the trajectory of the Second World War and established the strategic bombing doctrine that would influence military thinking for decades to come.